All right, let's get started. So today's presentation comes from Professor Alex Murphy. Alex Murphy is an assistant professor in sociology and in the Ford School of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate of the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. Murphy's research draws on the ethnographic methods to examine how poverty and inequality are experienced, structured, and reproduced. One line of research investigates the new suburban poverty and has focused on variations in social service responses to rising poverty, how suburban living uniquely shapes the experience of poverty, how suburbs are managing the economic and racial changes they're experiencing, and the theoretical, conceptual, and methodological issues suburban poverty raises for a sociological understanding of geography and inequality. Another line of research examines the causes and consequences of transportation insecurity among people living below the poverty line. All right, everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Alex Murphy.
All right, good morning. I want to just first say thank you for choosing to spend your time in this panel with me to learn about transportation insecurity and the Transportation Insecurity Index. Like Kelvin said, my name is Alex Murphy, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. And before I begin, I just want to recognize my co-authors and collaborators on this project, Alex Gouldworth and Jamie Griffin, Natasha Polkowskis, Nicole Kowalski, and Karina McDonald-Lopez. So I want to begin our time together by starting to ask you all a few questions about experiences you might have had. And when I ask you this, you have three response options. You can answer never, sometimes, or often. So I want to start by asking, in the past 30 days, how often have you had to arrive somewhere early and wait because of the schedule of the bus, train, or person giving you a car? So how many of you would say never? How many would say sometimes? How many of you would say you've often had to arrive somewhere early in the last 30 days? Okay. So in the past 30 days, how often would you all say you were not able to leave the house when you wanted to because of a problem with transportation? How many would say never? How about sometimes? And how about often? And how many of you would say in the last 30 days, how often did you worry about inconveniencing your friends, family, or neighbors because you needed help with transportation? How many would say never? How many would say sometimes? And how many would say often? And finally, how many of you would say in the last 30 days did you feel left out because you would not have the transportation you needed? How many of you would say you never felt left out in the last 30 days because of a problem with transportation? How many of you would say sometimes you felt left out? And how many of you would say often you've been feeling left out in the last 30 days? Well, based on extensive years-long qualitative work into the lives of low-income families in urban, suburban, and rural areas in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Chicago, my research team and I have come to learn that these are just some of the symptoms. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. Some of the symptoms of transportation insecurity, which we define as a condition in which one is unable to regularly move from place to place in a safe or timely manner due to an absence of resources needed for transportation. And the way we think about resources for transportation is very broadly. It can be money for gas and car repairs. It can be having friends who have cars and are able to give you rides, and it can be having the physical health to walk and in a built environment that can facilitate that walking, or perhaps getting around in a wheelchair. And it's a condition that can really have dire consequences, right? So transportation insecurity can make it difficult for people to obtain and keep work, to access social services, to move to safer neighborhoods, to take their children to school, to visit the doctor, to buy groceries, to visit friends and family, and so on. And while these experiences are things that transportation insecure people negotiate constantly, they and the concept and the idea of transportation insecurity itself have largely been overlooked and understudied. And one of the things that my team and I hypothesize is that one reason this is so is that researchers have really lacked adequate measurement tools to capture this phenomena. And in its absence, a lot of scholars and policymakers have used proxy measures to try to understand this phenomena. And so people have used things like mode of transit. So a lot of research looks at, do you have access? Do you use a car or public transit? And what does that mean for your ability to get around? People have looked at travel behavior, right? So what is your commute time? We've used activity-based models. People have studied, or especially urban planners, use neighborhood accessibility models that try to understand at the neighborhood level people's access, how walkable things are, people's access to things like job or public transit. And then people have also used one or all five of the 5 A's of access. And while these measures can be correlated with transportation insecurity, they're not always able to capture accurately people who are transportation insecure. So if we think about it, for example, car ownership measures often miss the fact that people can have cars and still be transportation insecure when they can't afford car repairs or gas to get around. Measurements of neighborhood accessibility miss the fact that people who live in neighborhoods that we would deem accessible may not have the physical ability to walk to places, or they may live in neighborhoods that have high crime and don't feel comfortable waiting at bus stops. And there can be a lot of variation within neighborhoods of who is transportation insecure and not, even though a neighborhood may seem, and how we measure it, is accessible. When we focus on travel behavior to understand people's ability to get around, these measures like commute times often don't capture trips that aren't taken, right? And then there's for people for whom transportation insecurity is so severe, we often can't capture the people who can barely get around, right? So the idea of unmet demand. And then none of the measures that we really have access to in our fingertips capture a key way that people who are often low-resourced or don't how they get around, which is their social networks, right? Their friends, family, and neighbors. And we don't have any ability to pick that up. And then finally, because researchers and policymakers often use these measures either inconsistently or because we have so many, it's often very hard for us to make comparisons and draw general conclusions across populations and outcomes. So we really don't have a common language and a common set of metrics that we can use to understand the full impact of people's inability to get around and what that means for all kinds of outcomes, whether it's health, education, employment, and those kinds of things. So why does this matter? Well, without a single valid measure of transportation insecurity, we really can't fully understand the landscape of transportation, nor can we gather the necessary information that we need to determine how to craft appropriate interventions that will effectively move people from transportation insecurity to transportation security and advance our goals around these issues. And so more specifically, without a single valid measure, we cannot answer some of the following questions. So it's very hard for us to know how many people are experiencing transportation insecurity, and who specifically in terms of population. It's very hard for us to know what the causes of transportation insecurity are and what its consequences might be. And it's hard for us to know what policies and technologies can effectively address transportation insecurity. And so for this reason, my colleagues and I over the last 8 years have been working on developing what we call the Transportation Security Index, which is the first single validated measure of its kind that's explicitly designed to capture transportation security as it's directly experienced by people on the ground, regardless of where they live, so whether they live in cities or rural areas, and regardless of what mode of transit they use. In using this index and original survey data, we've begun to try to answer some of the questions that I just laid out in the previous slide. So putting the index to work, what we've found is that we've published the first prevalence estimates of transportation insecurity in the US, and what we found in our data is that 1 in 4 people in the US over the age of 25 experience transportation insecurity. And just to put that number in context, this is double the percent of people who are food insecure in the US. And food insecurity, I think, is an issue that often gets a lot of attention. There's a lot of policy prescriptions that are used to intervene, and we don't get that kind of attention with transportation insecurity, even though double the percent of people are experiencing it. The same is true when we look at the prevalence of transportation insecurity among those living below the poverty line. So we found that 53% of people below the poverty line experience transportation insecurity. And again, that's double the percent that experience food insecurity. And then using this index, we were able to look at the prevalence of transportation insecurity by subgroups. So for example, looking at transportation insecurity by race and ethnicity, we documented that there's notable racial and ethnic disparities in who experiences transportation insecurities, with white Americans least likely to experiencing it, followed by Hispanics, and Black Americans most likely to experience it. We also looked at transportation insecurity by urbanicity and unearthed some really interesting findings. So for example, we found that people who are living in cities are much more likely to experience transportation insecurity than those in suburban areas and rural areas. And those living in suburban areas are much more likely to experience transportation insecurity than those in rural areas, which is counterintuitive to how we often think about where transportation insecurity exists. So that was a little bit of an overview of why the index that we're working on, I think, is warranted, and a preview of what kind of information it can generate. But for the rest of our time together, what I want to do is I want to dig in to more of a methods talk and touch on three things. So one is I want to preview sort of how we developed the Transportation Security Index, with a special focus on how the index is really informed by qualitative work and the lived experiences of people on the ground. And then I want to talk about next steps in index development and research on transportation and security that we've been doing. And then I want to just present a series of use cases to start the conversation with you all about how we can deploy the index around a number of different transportation equity initiatives. Okay. So if you were going to try and develop a measure trying to capture the transportation insecurity or the experiences of people, one question you might ask yourself is, how would you go about doing this? For us and our team, we determined that there was just entirely too many kinds of inputs into transportation insecurity to really capture and catalog these things, right? So if you think about, there's things like we would need to be able to measure whether people have a car, if they have money to pay for gas, if they have a valid license, if they have physical health to walk, if they have access to public transit, if it's runs frequently enough, if they have friends who have cars who can give them rides. We also thought it was going to be almost impossible to catalog all the destinations people might go to, right? So oftentimes we look at, can people get to work? But in the universe of your lives, you go to lots of places. You go to grocery stores, you go to church, you go to the voting booth, you go to your friends and family. And we just thought that unless we wanted to come up with a metric that had hundreds of questions that no one would want to answer, incorporating all of those kinds of things would be really difficult. So given this, what we did is we, in thinking about how to develop the TSI, we turned to the gold standard food security index. Like transportation, there are a lot of variables that affect food security, right? So your ability to purchase food, the cost of food, the quality of food, the amount of food that you eat, the number of people who are consuming the food in your household. And what makes the food insecurity index so brilliant is that what they realized is that it was going to almost be impossible to catalog all the things that make people insecure. But instead what they could do is they could create a measure that really captures, that captures and taps into the symptoms of food insecurity as people are directly experiencing them, right? So instead of asking people like, what was your caloric intake today, or did you eat enough protein and vegetables, they ask a series of questions that look like this. So for example, in the past 12 months, did you ever eat less than you felt you should because there wasn't enough money for food? Or the index asks questions like, the food that we bought just didn't last and we didn't have enough money to get more. And they ask, was that often, sometimes, or never true for your household in the last 12 months? So these are all symptoms that that the researchers who developed this index were observing qualitatively in the lives of people who were food insecure. And so for us, we thought this was a really good model. And so to develop an analogous set of questions that would measure the symptoms of transportation insecurity, what we did is we started by turning to our own qualitative data. We had ethnographic observations and we had over 187 interviews. And we analyzed this data to look through what we could identify as symptoms of transportation insecurity. And in doing so, what we found is that insecurity manifested in three ways, three sort of buckets. So the first manifestation that we identified is what we call the material manifestation. And these are the kinds of manifestations that can be physically observed and that relate to whether people can get around safely and in a timely manner. So people experiencing these manifestations find getting around very time-consuming. So consider, for example, Cynthia, one of the women that we came to know. She's a low-resource woman who lives on the south side of Chicago. She doesn't have a car, and she relies on a combination of public transit and rides from others to get around. Yet while she lives close to public transit, a woman was sexually assaulted at the transit stop by her house. And since then, she's not been using public transportation. Instead, she prefers, for safety reasons, if she can get one, to get rides from friends and family. But given her limited transportation options, like others who experience the material manifestations of transportation insecurity, Cynthia spends a lot of time commuting. She spends a lot of time waiting for rides to pick her up, and she spends a lot of time just planning how she's going to get from place to place and scheduling and thinking about even her backup options if one trip falls through. For this, she does this because of crime in her neighborhood, but for others, it's not because of crime, right? It's because they have to do all these kinds of things because they have to drive unreliable vehicles, for example, that break down, and they have to create backup plans and things like that. And when people like Cynthia can't secure a ride or their rides fail to show up, they have other kinds of manifestations like skipping trips. They just forego going places altogether, and they stop going places and can find themselves stuck at home for days on end or sometimes even weeks. So the second manifestation that we identified is what we were calling the relational manifestation. And these really pertain to the social strains that come from using one's social networks to get around, or they're social strains that are related to being isolated or not being able to interact or meet with people, see people because of transportation problems. Again, if we use Cynthia as our example, though she tries to get rides from friends and family members, she finds this extremely frustrating. Like people who are transportation insecure like her, she dislikes asking for rides because it makes her feel like a burden. And it's caused incredible strain on the relationship she has with those who give her rides. And trying not to be a burden, people like Cynthia try to ask for rides as infrequently as possible. And while this might help her mitigate not feeling like she's a burden, it just leaves her stuck at home and unable to go places where she might actually make social connections, right? Like church, or to go see and nurture her relationships with distant friends and family. So the third manifestation that we identified, and this ties to the relational manifestation, is emotional. Our respondents described experiencing a great deal of stress and worry related to their transportation problems, never knowing if they would be able to get to where they needed to go. They talk about having negative feelings related to their transportation situations as well, right? So people talked a lot about being embarrassed because they can't get around adequately. And one of our respondents, Gabriella, who also finds herself stuck at home quite frequently, tells us she was so isolated and stressed out and depressed because of transportation specifically that at times she breaks down and cries. In short, being stuck at home, managing strained relationships and social isolation, and constantly worrying about if you're going to get around and how can take a really emotional and psychological toll on people. So having identified these manifestations, the next thing that we did is we drew on our qualitative data to develop and brainstorm potential survey items that would tap into the experience of transportation insecurity. So we came up with 23 items that captured the material, relational, and emotional dimensions. So for example, some of the items tapped into things like people spending a long time waiting, being stuck at home, worrying about inconveniencing friends and family. And in doing this, in developing these questions, we were really careful not to include dependent variables that are affected by transportation insecurity. So a lot of people ask us when you'll see our questions, things like, well, why don't you ask people if they can go to the doctor? Or why do you not ask people if they can get to work? And the reason is we wanted to create an index that could be used in a causal inference framework so researchers could see whether transportation insecurity affects your health. And if we had included those kinds of questions, we couldn't look at those causal relationships. So after we came up with these symptoms, the next thing that we did is we conducted 52 cognitive interviews in Chicago and urban, suburban, and rural Michigan. And what cognitive interviews are they are a survey technique that's aimed to really help you understand whether the questions you're asking are understood by the respondents and whether you're then actually generating the kind of information you're hoping to with your survey questions. So what we did is we went out to people and we gave them our candidate items, and you do things like you ask people to read out loud the questions. And so we'd ask people, read out loud, and they'd read, in the last 30 days, how often have you had to spend a long time waiting for a ride to pick you up? And then what you ask people to do is, as they're reading it, tell you what they're thinking about as they're answering it. So what does spending a long time waiting mean to you? How long have you been spending a long time? What was the last time you spent a long time waiting? Tell me about that. And then when they answer sometimes, often, never, you seek to understand what they mean by sometimes, right? Does that mean like once? Does it mean 50 times, in the last 30 days? To get a real sense of are we capturing what we're hoping to? So once we completed these interviews, we coded responses for question comprehension, recall, and judgment. In doing so, we found that some of the items that we had were pretty burdensome for people to answer. We had a lot of questions that tied and asked people explicitly about whether they couldn't do things because of the cost of transportation. And we found that was burdensome, and so we refined items so that they don't specifically mention cost. We saw that some of our items were generating false positives, so we got rid of those. And then we developed a set of new items. And one of the things that we discovered in this process is that for people who are often most transportation insecure, those who have been chronically over long periods of time insecure, that really capturing their level of insecurity is very difficult. Because one of the things we identified is that we call it sort of have a changed universe. So if you ask people if they've had to skip a trip in the last 30 days, they'll say no. And then once you start talking to them, you realize like, oh, it's not that they're skipping trips. They don't even think about going places at all, right? And so we had to come up with a set of questions that would really try to capture these people specifically. And so we got questions, one of them was like, do you ever not go places because the hassle is just more effort than it's worth, than what the destination is? So after doing these cognitive interviews and after refining our questions, we then moved on to identify a preliminary index. And so in August 2016, what we did is we fielded an original survey on an online panel called the Knowledge Panel. And the survey was small. It just had 508 respondents. It was stratified to capture the experiences of low-income people. That was really the population we were most interested in making sure we were capturing. And we examined descriptive statistics and conducted an exploratory factor analysis. And what came out of that, so we had 23 candidate items, is we found that there was an index of 16 items that resulted. So each of the 16 items tapped into the symptoms of transportation insecurity, and in the index that we identified, all rely on a 30-day reference period. And just to illuminate why, the Food Insecurity Index asks people about a lot of questions that are at the 12-month reference period, but we thought that for transportation, people go places so much more often. In food insecurity can sometimes be more rare that we really wanted. And there's recall issues if you have 12 months. We wanted to get as accurate information as we could. For the 16 questions, all of the response options are never, sometimes, often. And just here's a couple of the questions that are on the 16. So we asked questions like, in the last 30 days, how often have you had to reschedule an appointment because of a problem? In the last 30 days, how often have you been not able to leave your house because of problems with transportation? And again, you've heard this one before, but in the last 30 days, how often did you worry about inconveniencing your friends, family, or neighbors because you needed help? So having identified this, the next thing that we did was we sought to validate this index on a nationally representative sample. So what this basically means is we sought to figure out if our findings, this index that we identified among a low-income population, would replicate among a population that was nationally representative and on a different survey. So in May 2008, we fielded a survey, again using the knowledge panel. This time, we had almost 2,000 respondents. Everyone was over the age of 25. And the reason that we've been sampling over the age of 25 is that we didn't want our results to be skewed by college-age students or people who might have sort of transportation situations in that age group that kind of don't reflect the general population. When we weight our data, respondent characteristics are comparable to the gold standard benchmark of the current population survey. And what we did when we got the survey is we examined descriptive statistics, we conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, and what we ended up doing was finding that, in fact, our 16-item index did replicate and so was validated on this nationally representative sample. So the next thing that we did is, one of the things you want to do when we did this was the index was really a continuous measure, and what people who want to use the index want to do with it is to identify who's transportation insecure. And so the thing that we did next was to figure out a scoring mechanism. So when you use the index, what we do is with the never, sometimes, often answers, you score, you assign everyone with a never a 0, everyone with a sometimes a 1, and everyone with often a 2. This means that any person can have a cumulative score of 0 to 32, with 32 being the score of those who experience the most symptoms and the most often. And so this is illustrated in this figure on the slide, which shows the distribution of our scores in our survey sample. And as you see, most people score a 0, and then you see that there's sort of, after that, there's patterns and breaks in the responses. And so what we did to identify, what we wanted to do was identify categories. So one thing that the Food Insecurity Index does is identify people who have, moderate or low or very severe food insecurity. And we wanted to do the same thing with transportation insecurity. So what we did is we used both quantitative and qualitative measures to investigate the data. And in this, we identified 5 categories of transportation insecurity. So there's people who have no insecurity. We identified a group of people who are marginal insecure. These are people who they generally don't have constrained travel, but they express sort of stress around getting around. Sometimes it's related to long commutes. We found people who had low insecurity. This is when you begin to see people who have constrained travel. It's not that bad, but you start to see it in the data. We identified a category that was moderate insecure. So these are people with scores of 11 to 16. The moderate insecure people are people who have more constrained travel than the low insecure people. But these are the people who also you begin to see that they report signs of stress and strain and emotional manifestations of insecurity. This is where you start to see people saying that they feel left out or embarrassed and things like that. And then we have a group of high insecure people who are the 17 and plus. These are people for whom transportation insecurity is very severe. Their travel is extremely constrained. They too report experiencing a lot of negative experiences. People for whom, we can talk about this in the Q&A, but their insecurity is just very, very severe. I guess you would say this is probably when you think about people who have the most skip trips, these are the people. So we have these 5 categories, and what these categories allow us to do is not just say who's insecure or not, right? But it really helps us understand the full experience of insecurity. So for instance, you'll recall that earlier I said that 25% of the US population is experiencing transportation insecurity. So when you look at this and you break it down, what we see is that 10% experience marginal insecurity, 6% experience low, 5% moderate, and only 3% of the population experiences high insecurity. And we might wonder again what this looks like for our most vulnerable groups, right? People who are living below the poverty line. And when we look at this, what we see is that, earlier I had said that 53%, so over half of people below the poverty line experience transportation insecurity. When we look at category, we get a much fuller picture. So the figure shows the prevalence using the 2018 federal poverty line. And what we see is when we look down at it, that the breakdown of severity within poverty group, we see that among people at or below 100% of the federal poverty line, we estimate that nearly a fifth of this population, so about 19%, experiences low insecurity. And we find that 20% and 12.8% experience moderate and high, respectively. And we can see here that those in poverty are much more likely to experience high insecurity than these other groups, right? So not only are they more likely to be insecure, but they're also more likely, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be in that high category. We also find that although people who fall between 100 and 200% of the federal poverty line, so people who technically aren't poor by federal standards, their rates of insecurity still greatly exceed the rates of insecurity experienced by individuals over 200% of the poverty line. And interestingly, we see there's in this figure that there's almost no observations of households at or above 200% of the poverty line who we estimate are experiencing high insecurity, right? So if you're not poor, that's very protective in general of that high category. Again, if we look at these categories by the question about where transportation insecurity is by urbanicity, we again get a better understanding of insecurity by geography. And we see here that not only are people living in urban areas more likely to experience some form of transportation insecurity, but they're also more likely to experience the most severe levels than are their suburban and rural counterparts. For those of you who are interested in rates of car ownership by transportation insecurity, we find that those who don't own cars are more than twice as likely to experience transportation insecurity, so about 42%, compared with car owners, only 18%. And though car ownership is relatively protective of transportation insecurity, nearly a fifth of those who own cars do report having some form of insecurity. But that being said, to the extent that car owners experience any insecurity, very few are experiencing the two highest levels, right? Very few, only 3% report experiencing moderate insecurity, and only 1% report experiencing high. So these categories are useful in helping us understand who is experiencing different degrees of insecurity, and they're also useful in helping us understand whether people with different levels of severity experience the same kind of hardships because of their security or their insecurity. So for example, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been looking at the relationship between transportation insecurity and physical and mental health. And what we've been finding in this work is that when you look at the relationship between transportation insecurity and physical health, what you see is sort of a step function where poor health is higher among anyone who has any level of insecurity than those who don't have any transportation insecurity. But there's really no differences in how people rate their health than among different levels of transportation insecurity, right? But we see something very different when we look at the relationship between transportation insecurity and symptoms of depression. So when we look at that, we find a nonlinear dose-response relationship with severity of transportation insecurity with large variation in magnitudes across categories of transportation insecurity. So basically, the more severe your insecurity, the more likely you are to experience depressive symptoms. So these findings just together suggest that this is a new area of research, but there's a lot more that we need to understand about transportation insecurity, levels of insecurity, and the relationship between outcomes we care about. Okay, so all this might sound great, and maybe it sounds interesting to you and useful, but for those interested in using the index, there's a pretty big challenge, and that is that 16 questions is just too long for most people. It's too long if you want to use it on the ground. It's too long in surveys where a lot of questionnaire real estate is pretty constrained. So recognizing this, the thing that we've been doing most recently is to identify and validate a short form index that consists of 6 questions. So to do this, what we did is we used a mixed methods approach to identify a preliminary short form of six items. And to do this, we conducted graded response models on our 2018 survey data, and we used our cognitive interview to identify question, comprehension, recall, and judgment. And we did this to see if there was any items that we could cut, that we could do without. We then fielded a nationally representative survey this past November, and this time we had over 2,000 respondents. And again, when it's weighted, the respondent characteristics are generally comparable to the CPS. And what we did with this new survey data is we conducted a split ballot experiment. So basically, we split the sample in half, and we gave half the people the long form, the TSI 16, so the survey was 16 items, and then we gave half of the people in the sample the short form, the 6 item. And then we did a bunch of different analyses to look at. One of the things we did is confirm the comparability of estimates using the 2018 and the 2022 samples. So we looked across all of our different waves of surveys to make sure that, first of all, the information we were getting from our respondents in 2022 was comparable to those in 2018. We then used a k-means cluster analysis to identify that there's 3 categories of insecurity for the TSI 6. So one of the trade-offs of using a shorter form is that most people won't ever have a sample size to get some of the very highest levels of insecurity. And so using the short form, you can identify three different levels rather than 5. And we looked at, we did some analyses to look at concordance. So this is percent agreement between the 2 forms and the kappa statistic. And then the third thing we did is to see if prevalence estimates from the 16 item index differed, and the TSI 6 differed. And we created a single 3 category TSI variable across the entire data set and estimated prevalence across the ballots. And we found that there was no significant difference between the ballots. So what this ended up doing is validating our 6 item short form with 3 categories of insecurity. That's much easier to produce, and that's very consistent with the outcomes and the information that's generated using the long form. So in terms of next steps, where we're going with this, we have a couple of things we want to do. So for some people, even 6 questions is a lot. There's people. The food insecurity has gotten their index. They started with 14, they've gotten down to 2. We are hoping that maybe we can develop an even shorter index with 3 items, but this to be determined. We're also trying to deepen our analysis of transportation insecurity in the US. So we've got a couple of papers that we're working on. One is we're looking at the relationship between transportation insecurity and employment, and this includes analyses on not just whether people are employed, but also what kinds of jobs and what their job characteristics are, so how transportation insecurity relates to people doing shift work, part-time work, all those kinds of things. We're looking at, there's, for people who are poverty researchers, a lot of what people look at as material hardship measures, right? So people consider housing insecurity and food insecurity and whether people have a hard time paying their bills and medical care insecurity. And so we've got a couple papers that are looking at what's the relationship between transportation insecurity and these other kinds of material hardships, and how can we understand, once we account for transportation insecurity, how can we account for material hardship in the US? A couple of examples of analyses that could be done that we haven't quite started, but this question about insecurity across different geographies, right? One question that we are really interested in is you can imagine that what makes you insecure in an urban area is very different than a rural area. And so we really want to dig into sort of what are the causes of insecurity in different geographies. Another thing we could look at is what is the relationship between transportation insecurity and mode use and difficulty paying for transportation-related costs, right? So, are there key drivers? If you're a car owner, what are the things that are really burdensome for you to continue to be? What's creating your transportation insecurity in terms of what's financial hardships you're facing, and that might be very different for people who aren't car owners. And then we want to look at differences and patterns of insecurity and the related correlates between the surveys we conducted in 2018 and 2022. So far, we haven't seen a huge difference, which is surprising given that there was COVID. But we also fielded the 2022 survey after I don't know if COVID's over, but not at the pinnacle of COVID, and also sort of we missed the high gas prices. But so digging into a little bit more about what are the differences across these two time periods in terms of what people are experiencing and who. And then the other thing we're going to continue doing is we've been working a lot with NPOs and transit advocates and researchers and others who are interested in using the index and helping them think about how they can deploy it in their own work. And that leads me to just closing with discussing a couple of use cases under which the TSI can be used. So I think there's a lot, but I'll just throw out a couple that we've thought about and that are maybe the most obvious. So one of the reasons that we created the index was both to be able to measure insecurity and really have a way to understand, just how many people are experiencing this. But we also thought that what we needed was we really thought this would be a useful tool to evaluate transportation interventions and determining whether they're actually effectively moving people from transportation insecurity to transportation security. And to think about, whether or not, I think, the index can be used to think about what kind of interventions actually do that work, or how do you move people from high insecurity to moderate to low. And I think there's a lot of questions around, that maybe the people who are this is just a hypothesis, that people who are in the very high insecurity category are going to need a different kind of intervention. It's going to be much harder to move them to even the moderate than perhaps moving the people from the moderate to the low. So the index so far has been used as an evaluation tool in the South Bend's Commuter Trust Program. So this is a program where they've gotten the largest employers in the city to come together to provide ride-hailing vouchers or bus passes, and they're really trying to get their workers to work consistently and on time. And so they've been using the TSI to evaluate whether the program is working in that way and what that means on the employer side for whether people are on time, whether they're having better employee retention rates and things like that. The TSI is also going to be used in this way to evaluate the DC's free fare pilot program that will be rolled out soon. Another use case for the TSI is that you could use it to document the prevalence of insecurity and track it over time on reoccurring nationally representative surveys to see whether disparities are widening or closing, right? And to see how things like gas prices are influencing that, to see how things like the changing geography of poverty. So the majority of low-income people in the U.S. now live in the suburbs. So, how is that shaping, widening, or closing transportation insecurity over time? How are new transportation technologies like AVs, right? What are their implications for transportation insecurity? We don't just need to do this at the federal level. States and NPOs could field their own surveys using the TSI to document these kinds of patterns more locally. And over time, this data could be really used to examine how investments in transportation are shaping transportation insecurity across populations, and what kinds of returns on investment states and localities are getting from investing in transportation, right? So we can think about, at the regional level, if you invest in transportation and this is moving people from insecurity to security, is our cities and regions getting additional tax revenue or increased regional competitiveness, right? Because of higher employment or things like that. Another use case is that cities and NPOs, or really anyone, could use the index to identify geographic hotspots of transportation insecurity, and they could use this to decide how and where to more effectively allocate resources, right? So where do we want to put in new public transit stops? Where should we target people who need transit vouchers? Even nonprofits who provide social services, if you want to know, where should we, instead of asking people to come to us, where are there geographic hotspots where maybe we would be more effective in just going there and providing people food or things like that. Another use case is that health providers, social services, and advocacy organizations can use the TSI as a screener to identify patients and clients who are transportation insecure, and then use this information to connect them with the appropriate transportation-related related assistance. So since we've been working on this, we've actually gotten a lot of interest from people in the healthcare field who are really interested, and they have a lot of screeners that they use to understand the social determinants of health, and this is one way that they would love to use the TSI. And then finally, another use case is just that government and philanthropic foundations could use the TSI to make data-driven decisions about how and where funding should be targeted, right? So for example, localities could be required to report their prevalence estimates of insecurity to qualify for funding. If we think about sort of the community development block grant, they do this similarly for poverty levels at the neighborhood level, or government and philanthropy could ask people to articulate how funding would be used to alleviate transportation insecurity and show that actually happened across the life of a project. So as you can see, I think there's many use cases, and I'll just close by thanking you and see if you have any questions, and open it up.
Thank you, Alex, for that presentation. It was amazing, and I knew of it, and I'd read the journal article, but hearing you explain it in detail and going through each of the steps was phenomenal. One of the questions that we run into sometimes is this sense of pride in, especially in rural or certain communities where they're just like, I don't want it. Like, they will decline public transit or paratransit because they don't want it showing up in their driveway because they're afraid what their neighbors will think. Or they say, if the public transit comes and gets me, my husband or my son will think that I don't trust him anymore. Like, there's these really complex dimensions, especially in older adults, in accepting help or accepting that transportation provided by another entity isn't a source of failure or a sense of that they're not good enough, or the what would the neighbors think comes up all the time, and it's mind-blowing to me. But and I know in your cognitive interviews, those would have been fascinating to kind of, was that teased out as part of that?
Well, so we definitely saw that in our interviews, in the cognitive interviews. I'm thinking back to a woman in a rural area. She was an older woman, and she said never to all of our questions. And then I started talking to her. I was like, but you spend all your time at home. And, we asked her, do you feel like, do you worry about inconveniencing your friends and family? And she said, no, my family loves to pick me up, so like there is a lot. I mean, this is one of the reasons we, I'm biased, but one of the reasons we like this index is that it tries to capture that there are relational and emotional dimensions to this, right? That like, it's not just about the hard material stuff. And a lot of times we get pushback from economists who say like, well, who cares about, or people will say, can we just skip all the relational, like we don't really care about that. And both, I think we find not just qualitatively, but also quantitatively that these two things, the material, being late, skipping trips, all that stuff, you can't disentangle them. They're part and parcel of the same underlying construct. And so if you really want to understand this, you have to understand what's going on with people who are feeling like, there's stigma attached to certain services, or that like, all those kinds of things. So we definitely identified it and tried to, I think our questions, one of the things we tried to do in the cognitive interviews is, we have to kind of get questions that will tap into people's experiencing this, but the risk is that like questions can be so harmful to your sense of self when you're answering it that people don't want to be honest, right? And so, some of the questions that we got rid of were generating false positives, or some were just too kind of difficult for people to answer honestly because to think about yourself in this way is hard. So, I mean, I think it's a real challenge of these things, and we certainly saw that. And so I think, to your point, is, for people who want to do something about this and craft interventions, thinking about that, we often think about, these are real reasons for not taking up things, and we have to think about how we can meet people where they're at, because it's not just a matter of getting, this very well, right, people from point A to point B, but in a way that actually works for them in the context in which they live. And probably that women are, maybe hesitant to take up whatever transit being offered because they don't want to offend their son, but they also don't want to ask their son for too many rides, right? And so, right, yeah.
I think that sense of self is critical for those questions.
Yeah, yep.
This is a very useful research.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, you have this index, and if you want to apply it to a new habitat, a new town, a new community, how do you go about doing it?
Well, like Henry and I talk a lot, if you have money, you can do anything, but well, I mean, so ideally what you would do, is figure out a way, get some survey experts to figure out how to survey the population, and what is your response, what population size do you need, and what is sort of the parameters of that to be representative of that new town or new habitat. So that's the most ideal, but that takes, surveys are not cheap, but that would be the answer. But I mean, that would be the gold standard. Some people don't have those resources, and I think community development corporations or all kinds of nonprofits could also knock door to door and just try and get a good response rate. And it's not perhaps representative, but you can still do a lot with data to try to understand what people are experiencing. And you can't say that the whole township is experiencing this, and you can't say, what maybe the racial disparities are, but you can say, out of the sample that we got, here's what we learned, right? So I think there's a wide range of ways you can approach this, given how constrained or unconstrained your resources are.
One of the questions that we see when we started working with community health workers and they were doing the community health needs assessment, or the you do it when you go in and you identify if you're in food insecure, housing insecure.
The screeners?
Yeah, the screeners. And there was some research that was done that showed if it was asked to you versus if you independently filled it out on a tablet, there was a variance in the data. And in some cases, people felt less judgment, like we talk about sense of self, verbalizing that versus clicking that tab or that button. Is that something that's been looked at so far? And again, they've been doing those screeners for 10 years, and it was the first time that they'd kind of made that connection within the healthcare environment to say if the person self-purports it versus has to verbalize it to a nurse or somebody that they're talking to in the office, the results are different.
That's a great question. Yeah. So, index development and validation is an ongoing process. I don't think it ever ends. And so the Food Insecurity Index, the first version was done in 1996, and they're still developing it. So I think this is an empirical question and something that we need to look into. So far, again, because of constrained resources, we've largely used this online panel, the Knowledge Network, and their panelists have been shown to be nationally representative. But it's an online panel, and they're provided, the internet, and they're provided tablets and things like that. But you can imagine that there's people who just don't feel comfortable with the internet who aren't opting in, right? So we don't, one of the things that we need to do is figure out, like, if you're administering this with just a paper or over the phone, are we going to get the same kinds of results? And you'd want to validate it across different kind of mode usage, just like you're saying. You'd also want to validate it across different, in different languages, and there's just always tons of work to do, like question ordering. How much does question ordering matter? If we start changing questions, how much does that throw off results and things like that? So we haven't done this, but I think that's again more next steps that would be good to look into. Yeah.
I want to echo, thank you for the research. It's very important and fascinating. Question is, do you see gender implication in your TSI?
So that's a great question. So we thought that we would. We don't find significant gender differences, and we don't find significant differences with households with children, which are very surprising because qualitatively we were seeing that people who have especially very young kids, this can often be a barrier to getting around easily. It could be that we don't have, our sample size was small. We weren't able to dig into like whether maybe it's an issue of if you have children and they're very small, they're very young, that maybe is different than if you just have children. There's a lot more work to be done on this, but we did not find significant gender differences, which, there's all kinds of findings that we are trying to puzzle through what to make of them, and I think we'll take a little bit of time to figure it out. The urbanicity question, I think, is one we want to figure out. We found that also seniors, people over the age of 64, are less likely to be insecure than younger people, which again is counterintuitive. We often think that seniors are more likely to be insecure, and it could be that there's a couple of things that could be going on. It could just be that our panel is online and that there's people who aren't comfortable with technology who filled it out. It could be that people are not getting out, or older people, not because of transportation problems, but because they don't feel safe. They worry about falling or things like that may be harder to mitigate with a transportation intervention. But I think these are all things that we'll need a lot more quantitative and qualitative data to really understand. And I, just on this point of sort of how to investigate this, I was talking to someone, a pediatrician who's really interested in using the index to understand insecurity, and we talked about that. You could use the index as an interview protocol itself, right? And it doesn't just have to. You could use the index and ask people. You could score people so you knew what your respondents were in terms of transportation insecurity, but you could kind of, in the way the cognitive interviews were done, really, use the index and say, okay, in the last 30 days, you weren't able to get out very often. Tell me about this more. And I think, there's a lot more to be explored and a lot to use this with. So that's a great question. And yeah, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Murphy. Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. Also, I'm Sarah CCAT. I'm the Mobility Director at Spark. And I just came from Mcity shortly ago, and one of the great projects that I got to work on there was the Detroit project, where they're going to be, doing an AV deployment with a target population of, elderly, struggling with disabilities and lack of access to transportation. We got to work with Ford, and they did a really great collaboration work study and community engagement. And one of the things that really came out of that and working with the community was like access to places of joy. Like they want to go to the park, they want to go to a concert, they want to go to the museum, they want to go to the casino, because they don't want to ask family or friends to do those things for them. They're already doing enough. So I'm curious, in your research, in your surveys with the TSI, do you feel like having access or access to transportation to get to places of joy is contained within the TSI, or is that outside of the scope?
I mean, so the TSI can't pick that up, but what it can do is if you asked, if you used it in a survey, you could ask about whether they're getting to spaces of joy and see whether transportation insecurity, if you're more insecure, you're going to less spaces of joy, right? And you could, I could imagine trying to really figure out what that means for people's mental health, right? And all kinds of things. Qualitatively, I've seen that a lot. And Valerie's nodding her head, I'm sure you've seen it too, but that people use friends and family to get around, but those are for really vital trips. They're not, they're using it sparingly, even though their friends and family often think that they're using them all the time. They have no sense of how many trips they're withholding and holding back, right? But these, I'm just thinking about a woman I spent a lot of time with in the suburb outside of Pittsburgh. She had 2 small kids. She had no car. She depended heavily on friends and family for rides, and that was only for things like getting her child to the doctor or going to the grocery store. And she pinned her rides on the schedules of everyone else. And eventually, in her time that I knew her, she got a car, and her life just completely transformed. And part of it was that she got to those spaces of joy. She actually got to take advantage of what was in the community, like going to Halloween parade. Like it was the small things, and it was also the small things in some ways that ate at her the most. It was like, I remember one time she was supposed to buy a gift for someone for a baby shower, and her ride fell through, and so she had to go to the shower without a gift. You know, like those are the, you know, getting to work and getting to all these other places is really important. But the small things I think are really, for some people, are just equally as important. And yeah, but I think that's a great question, and that we should be asking more about. I think a lot of times we focus on the other things, but I think thinking holistically about people, right? If they can't get to places of joy, that has all kinds of spillover effects and other things. And for their kids, I think, you know, one area that I'd really like to investigate is what is the effects of, if you have parents who are transportation insecure, what are the downstream effects for children and their sort of life outcomes over the life course? I think that's a huge thing that we don't understand that would be good to look into. Yeah, thank you.
So exciting. I can't wait for the next research that you'll be performing. But my thing is, when are we going to learn from you the correlations between mental health and transportation insecurity, food insecurity, transportation insecurity, the correlations in communities where all those variables are important?
As soon as possible.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for the very interesting work. So I have two questions. The first question is basically in your index calculation, is the shared bike service is considered as the transportation service?
We consider anything. So one of the things we have, it's not part of the index, but in the surveys we've done, one of the first questions people encounter is a long list of types of transportation, and we use that to prime them to think like, you know, there's all kinds of ways you get around, including walking. You know, like we want you to think that it's not just a car and it's not just public transit, but there could be, and we put in, you know, friends and family, carpooling, all kinds of things. So we put that in there. I think there's one of the things that we really need to understand, and we have the data, but we haven't looked at it yet, is how are those modes related to insecurity, and just sort of breaking it down. I think that, you know, one thing I didn't mention, but important next step would just be to look at all these sort of qualitative, descriptive statistics. I think are really important. But you could certainly look at that, how many people were thinking about that and how it relates to that mode. That I don't know.
Great. So the second question I have is basically, I'm curious about your thoughts of how we can apply these index in tackling the transportation equity issues, which is big problem right now. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's so many different ways, right? I think one is, I believe that descriptive statistics are powerful. So just even identifying that there's the equity. I mean, we know it, but even, you know, like here, showing that there are racial and ethnic differences, there are differences by income, there are differences like those. So just, you know, one is you can use the index to do this in your communities, in your states. I think, you know, in my dream world, we would be able to get this index adopted in some nationally reoccurring survey so that we could understand, much like food insecurity, right? That, you know, as COVID was happening, what is happening with transportation insecurity? Things are getting shut down, public transit's getting shut down, you know, maybe, we don't know, like, maybe, you know, I mean, there's anecdotal evidence, I think, a little bit about, based on people's, you know, whether they're driving and things like that. But I think if we could know, you know, when gas prices are spiking, what is this doing to transportation insecurity? When benefits are being cut, what is this doing to transportation insecurity? So having some kind of reoccurring survey collection, I think, would really help us understand these kinds of things. But that we, but, you know, are people getting to vaccines and vaccinations, like all kinds of things. But I think we could do that at the federal level. All states could do this. We could be comparing insecurity by state and understanding who's performing well. We could do this by region, you know, and then I think using it as an evaluation tool to really say, like, when we're doing this intervention, if we're putting new public transit stops, if we're giving free fares, what is this doing to, again, move people from insecurity to security, and what is it doing also to close, you know, the disparities that we're seeing existing? So if only one group of people, you know, if are moving from insecurity to security, we're making headway, but not the kind that we might want to make, right? So I think I mean, we did
Similar to how we provide housing subsidies, we provide daycare subsidies, we provide so many different components. Can we provide a transportation subsidy, so based upon income, similar directive, but make it multimodal? And I think one of the challenges that the transportation world is struggling is also with universal APIs, and how do we get the data standards together? So VIA's technology talks to the transit agency's technology, talks to the scooters technology, and they don't have to rewrite the code every single time. And I think if there was a carrot out there of this, you will get access to, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in rides through a mobility subsidy or a mobility wallet, I think that would incentivize coordination, because I think that's a barrier that we see on the technical side. Has any of that come up in conversations around the modes, trying to figure out how do we address this? Or is it just, this is so hot off the presses, the modes are like, oh, hey, that was my way of saying interested, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we've had this, but I think, Valerie, what you're pointing to is a really important thing that I think this measure is uniquely able to do, and that we don't have. I mean, I think what is new way of thinking in the transportation world is transportation at the individual level, right? Often we think about it at a neighborhood level. And so a lot of our investments are at the neighborhood level communities. We don't have food stamp. We don't have, there's Section 8, HUD has Section 8 for individuals, and USDA has food stamps, and there's energy and light bills for people, but we don't really have an analogous kind of benefit for transportation. So, I mean, I think people are starting, I think this conversation is happening, and people are starting to think about it, and I think it's an exciting time to be having these discussions, because people are on board, and there's a lot of money to be put into these things and look at them. And I think all I'll say is I think it's exciting time to be. We're not, there's so many people thinking about this and thinking really broadly and in innovative ways, and so I think we're going to see some good work coming out, and hopefully good work that really moves the needle on these things. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
That's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking Dr. Murphy for her time.